Now for our roundtable with our longtime News Channel 5 political analyst Brian Crowley. And you and I, of course, spoke earlier this week on the passing of former Florida Governor and U.S. Senator Bob Graham. Died at the age of 87. We're going to talk more about that, but first I'd like our viewers to see some of the perspective you offered earlier this week. His work days made him famous. Ordinary jobs. Bob Graham took on more than 400 of them, from sanitation worker to busboy to school teacher and many more. They launched him from his Miami area roots as a state lawmaker to the governor's mansion in 1978.
This is a guy who was a multimillionaire. His father had run for governor and lost, and he had gone to Harvard Law School. But his work days that he started when he first ran for governor really got him to understand the working people of the state. And it made an enormous impact on the kind of governor and the kind of man he became.
Brian Crowley covered Graham during his 2 terms as governor, working as the Palm Beach Post Capitol Bureau Chief.
He was a man who really cared deeply about Floridians.
During and after the Mariel boat lift, Graham fought Washington for needed resources. Always a meticulous note-keeper, he always looked at the bigger picture.
You know, Bob Graham was always a man of vision for what he thought would be best for the long-term health of the state. So he would look at education reforms. He would look at protecting the environment in Florida. 2
terms as governor led to 3 terms as a U.S. senator. Graham was known far and wide for a sense of humor. And when he thought it necessary, a spine of steel. In 2003, he voted against going to war in Iraq, one of a handful of Democrats to do so.
He objected to us going into Iraq. He thought it was wrong. And as it turned out, he was right.
Graham, at that time, the Senate Intelligence Committee chairman, was resolute.
He believed going into Iraq was a waste of our resources, that we should be concentrating on going after terrorists.
We must become one America.
A 2004 presidential bid went nowhere for Graham. He would exit the political stage, but remained a thoughtful, influential voice. Then and now, a reminder of what bipartisanship looked like.
And not insisting that it had to be his way only is something we need to get back to. And it's a great legacy.
Brian, thanks for joining us, as always. Is it silly nostalgia or political romanticism that's misplaced to say they don't make them like that anymore on either side of the aisle? Yes, no, if so, why or why not?
Well, unfortunately, we don't make them like that anymore. You know, I can't emphasize enough, and I'm so glad there were so many pictures of him doing those work days. Those work days gave him a connection with Floridians that few politicians had. And he took his work days very seriously. He continued doing them when he was in the Senate. Overall, he did 400 work days. And when he did a work day, he didn't care if the cameras were there. He didn't care if I was standing there with my notebook. You know, he stayed for the entire work day. And whether he was working on a garbage truck or, you know, working in the fields, working as a teacher, he did the entire day, and his goal was to work with those people, and people didn't forget it. And he learned and understood a lot about what concerned Floridians.
I believe his last Senate race he won with something like 62% of the vote. He was beloved, and it takes more than just a ton of Democrats. He had cross-party appeal. Independents loved him. Could a Bob Graham exist in today's political echo chamber? Could an E. Clay Shaw, noted Republican congressman, could they exist and thrive and create policy in today's world?
It would be very difficult.
Why?
Well, we're so hotly divided. We're not divided, we're hotly divided. You know, there's almost a hate on either side. Now, it's been very difficult, and Bob Graham had a very difficult first year or so as governor. St. Pete Times notably called him Governor Jello in his first year because he was struggling. There was a scene that the then Dempsey Barron, who was the king, of the Senate from the Panhandle, and you did not do anything in the legislature that Dempsey Barron didn't approve of. And Governor Graham was having a meeting with some lawmakers, and Dempsey came strolling into his office, sat on his desk with his back to Bob Graham and started talking to the other folks how, by God, it was his legislature and nothing was happening without him. Bob Graham just shrugged and kept on going.
And how did he grow beyond that? How is specifically on policy, how did it grow?
Because it wasn't his way or the highway. He always started out, as he described it, on the 50-yard line, not on the 10-yard line. And his goal was to bring people together to work on a policy and to compromise. He was also a pragmatist. He was a middle-of-the-road Democrat. He was not a hardcore liberal by any means. He was very pro-death penalty, which you would find very unusual for a liberal Democrat. And he was just very pragmatic, and he brought that with him to the U.S. Senate. And as chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, he was willing to take on the entire Senate and Congress, and when it came to going into, and the White House, to say going into Iraq is wrong.
And speak a little bit more to that. He really spent the late end of his career. It took political courage, whether people then or now agree or disagree, but he was one of a very small group that opposed the war in Iraq. He said weapons of mass destruction. He didn't think the intel was there. He thought there was a lot more going on that we weren't thinking and talking about, and he would spend the rest of his life in and out of politics talking about that.
Well, up until the last few years when his health diminished,
precipitously.
he very, very aggressively pushed the White House and the intelligence community to release more information about the Saudi Arabian involvement in 9/11. As the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, he had some information that pointed to that direction. He felt that a lot of it was being hidden by the intelligence community. And in fact, there's documentation of the assistant FBI director at the time basically telling Bob Graham after he's out of the Senate to back off. But he didn't, and he was determined to get as much information as possible released about the Saudi Arabian involvement, and did a very, very successful job. We didn't get all of the information. There's still some we haven't gotten, but the information that came out suggested that he was right.
He would live, of course, to see the candidacy of his daughter, Gwen Graham. I remember bumping into his wonderful wife, Adele, on the trail, talking about that. They were so proud her candidacy foundered. But still, the political roots he planted went far and wide. Final thoughts on somebody who was thought of and will always be remembered as a statesman, and I think it's fair to say one of the most popular figures in Florida political history, regardless of party. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is fair. I think that, you know, if you're, 40 or younger, you probably don't have much connection with Bob Graham or that time, and that's kind of a shame. He said
but his policies on the Everglades, education, live on.
You're living that. And but I think the most important legacy that I wish we could grab hold of is his willingness to work with the other side, to work with people who disagreed with him, not to be hostile about things, and to compromise and to do the kinds of things that our founding fathers expected a Congress to do.
Well, let's finish on a humorous note, because he had a great sense of humor. Tell the story about when he showed up at political skit day in the uniform.
Well, let me just start with saying that whenever he showed, he basically took over the political press corps skits that we had. And in his final skit, he showed up wearing a white uniform that looked like a military uniform. He had the Marching 100 with him from FAMU, and pronounced that he was now going to be governor for life, and was marching with the band through, and he also, in one press corps skit, he suddenly showed up on stage with Jimmy Buffett. So,
And you could cover him, and I know you did, because a tough reporter and a lot of shoe leather, you could cover him and take him to task on issues or inconsistencies. But there was a part of the press corps back in that day that could also see that side. It was a different kind of relationship, tough and adversarial as it needs to be, but still could have those moments. And you don't see much of that anymore.
No, you sure don't. You're lucky now if the current governor even talks to reporters. So
we'll come
very
back.
different.
We'll come back with your final thoughts, Brian, in just a moment. Thanks for sharing that. We'll be back in just a moment.